Well, hello, this is Dr. Chris Lemmon, and this is my August chat that attached to the blog. And so today I'm going to see if I can catch on to a couple of concepts. Usually when I'm talking about a theory or concept. And the truth is that all these theories and concepts integrate and they have their own time signature element of how much exposure that comes into it and how they play out and how they dance with energy, right? So my whole theory is that I'm not looking at the correct answer or more, I'm looking at influence. What influences people, how we can influence people, how we can benefit that, how we can put that on guard or put that off guard. And so it's just the nature of influence. And so that's my theory in teaching. So when I started teaching, I was looking at what influenced you to become sick, what influenced you to become all of a sudden scared, what influenced you all of a sudden to become amazingly inspired by something or even addicted to something. What is making all that happen? Those are my questions. And I think that if we can start to look at those and examine those a little bit, get comfortable looking at them, then we can go ahead and start to have an influence ourselves, have an influence on, and have other people help with influence to be able to make changes. And so that's the ability to adapt and to make changes. The whole package called human life goes through a process and make those changes. But individually, I think we mirror that and we go changes, right? All right. When we start to look at unconscious patterns is still a debate out there, whether they're learned somewhere in the first 3, 4, 5 years of life, or they're learned in womb, or they're just part of biology because of the fact that we can look at cells in a petri dish underneath a microscope and if they're healthy, they stay separated and they move around a little bit and they have this defensive piece. And as they get comfortable with them and the energy rate changes, it seems like there's some type of information applied in there or present within that context. So we just don't know, right? And that's what happens is I think that if you've ever had a little dog, you get a little puppy and they're just all friendly as all heck. They just run over and they climb all over you, lick you, they're just all friendly. You get a dog that's a rescue dog or a dog from the pound that's a little bit older. They're on guard, they're a little cautious at first because they've had some experiences maybe in life. And then after a little while, they're comfortable. Um, I've been I travel a lot, and I've been many places where there are deer from Canada all the way to Washington State. And I go out and I sit down on the ground and deer are feeding on the grass. And I sit there for a little while. And next thing you know, they're coming over and they're eating the grass right next to me. It's like they just decided I wasn't a threat. But it took a little while. If I would have walked in and approached them, their heads would have come up, ears pop up, their eyes open up, and they are looking around, deciding not anything about you. They're deciding how to get away from you. And so that takes all their full train in their mind, all dedicated to that survival piece. And those are the type of patterns that we talk about when we talk about pattern response. So a lot of times when we do silly things, it's because it's a pattern that shows up. It was a defensive pattern, or we have worked around defensive patterns and we've got dumb to it. We got playing with knives and stuff, and then we've lost our caution. So one of the two extremes happen. We lose that sense of middle ground or lose that sense of balance, right? So when we start to look at that, we had how does that influence us and how can we mitigate that influence, but not so much to the fact that we still don't have the caution notice on it, right? So that gets the drill. It was kind of like there for a long time. Bicycles came with stickers all over them saying, be careful, riding this bicycle is dangerous. I remember buying those bicycles for my kids and then spending hours with alcohol trying to get all those stupid stickers off because a kid's going to go down the hill on a bicycle and be reading this sticker. I mean, that would be dumb too. Um, it's an overreaction too. We overreact too, and that's the problem, out of balance. So we're looking at balance and we're looking at patterns that fire. They're in us somehow or another. And we actually then take those patterns, my definition, and we start to attach stories to them. I one time saw a snake. This was my experience to it. Um, and I was a little kid, maybe 5 years old. I was going out by a lake and I'm wandering out by a lake and I see this little snake, maybe 8 inches long, maybe not even quite small. And I thought, oh, cool. And I see its head, it's laying there. Now, I don't know. It's, of course, sunning itself because it needs to get sunshine because it doesn't have body warmth. So I go over and I pick it up behind the head. I got it. It's a little twisty turny. It wants to get away from me. I maybe 5 blocks from my house. So I'm carrying it home as a kid. I'm carrying this thing. So I get to my house and I'm out there looking at it and I knock on the door. My grandmother answers and I say, look what I found. And she kind of freaks out because it's a poisonous snake. And she goes, and she doesn't know what to say. She doesn't know what to do. She's just all panicky. So I'm sitting there looking at the snake and looking at her and trying to figure out, she doesn't like snakes. I mean, like, I don't know. The snake's okay. By now, the snake is wrapped around my hand. It's just calm. It's relaxed. It's not struggling with me. I'm not hurting it. So it's got past its original threat. Um, and so I'm thinking, wow, okay. And then the last thing she said was, put it back where you got it. So it's like, gosh, now I got to walk 5 blocks back over. So I did. I walked 5 blocks back over. I got the snake. I put my hand in the water a couple times, and when it felt the water, it relaxed. And then I just tossed it out in the water, and it was just swam away. And it was just like, yeah, I had no idea that it was a poisonous snake. Um, and she didn't do a very good job of communicating or being actually inspiring me. Now, if it would have been moving or if it would have been aggressive, I probably would have never touched it. But it was just basically like asleep. It was laying there, sunning itself, having a nice time. And I just grabbed it right behind the neck and it couldn't do anything. So, um, what can I say? That's how these things come. Now I just shared a story with you. So now the story just means that now the next time I run into a snake, I have a piece of information based with the story. Now I know from that story that other people freak out. I might not freak out. I have a sense of trying to reach for them. However, I have been around a lot of snakes, and some of them, if you can't just make a direct reach, just straight down and grab them behind the neck, if they have a little bit of maneuverability, they'll turn around and strike. Even if they're not poisonous, they'll still bite you. I've had a pet racer for a while, and I was camping out, so I was sleeping with it. And it seemed like it was a wise thing to have that pet because of the fact that it would eat any rodents or anything coming around. It was a defensive element. So it was my pet and it was defending. And while I would be sleeping, it would curl up. But if anything came out of the brush, that rascal would be out of the blanket and taking a look at it or smelling it or doing what it did to defend itself. It was attentive. And so I had a pet, but one night I rolled on it and it actually bit my arm. It was a small bite, but it was like most certainly got jabbed. Woke me up and I go, wow, okay, And then we just went back to sleep. We got along fine. It just let me know I was kind of rolling on it, crushing it a little bit. So I now have two stories I told you about snakes. Do you see how that expands my experience with them? Are poisonous snakes dangerous? Without question. Without question, right? So you should know that. And if you're going to go out around snakes, you should know which ones are poisonous and which ones are not. And friendly snakes, I'm sorry, are they dangerous? Yes, most certainly, right? They'll bite you too. They might be a little friendlier and they might be a little more manageable, and you might be able to train them some degree. But so I'll tell you a third story. I had a snake. It was a pet in a glass cage. We would buy mice from the pet store and feed it, mice. And and so it was just a pet. They're not a good pet. They're not very friendly. They're not much of anything. I was just like, but someone actually gave it to me because they were moving. And so I had it and I was going to sell it and I had it for sale and it took about 5 or 6 months to sell it. So it was there until I sold it. Um, and I fed it and I took care of it. Every now and then I'd get it out and it would curl up in my hand and I'd be sitting there reading a book and my hand would be there and it'd be curled in my hand and it'd just be asleep. And then every now and then it would start to move, and then it would start to move. I'd kind of go back and forth with my hands and have it crawl around, and it would just settle into a different position. You spend a lot of time sleeping. It liked the warmth of my body because it requires warmth. And it would start to get a little cold feeling. I would put it back into its cage, its glass container, and where it had heat lights, and a warmed up rock, and it would be happy on that. Rock was had a heating unit and electrical, and so it would be happy camper in there. And every now and then we need to feed it. That was pretty much it until I sold it. So that's a third level of like, I had a relationship. Now, one time we did a workshop and we were playing with some symbols, elements outside. So we were looking at petroglyphs and carvings in trees from the natives that were in that area one time and that were run out of that area um, by the government. And we were down there and we were looking at markings in trees and scratchings in rocks and so on and so forth. And we were sitting around, there was 27 I had in this workshop. And, and we were sitting around out there in the woods, kind of looking at the symbols and kind of like being intuitive, which just meant that we're taking some data and making up the rest at our best guess, right? So it's not, it's a phenomenon, without a doubt. It's a phenomenon. It's a legitimate response from your body and your experience, but it doesn't come into the criterion of being a logical set of data. So this is a little bit shady to make a gap between, because if you take a word in English and you translate it into French, and then try to translate it back in English again, you wind up with something totally different. So I've tried that and I've used that in workshops. So now we translated words into French, and then we would translate the English word into German, and then we just go ahead and look it up on the computer and try to translate it back to we don't always track back. What I'm saying is that we assume that all of us humans, when we arrive at a logical set of information, it's all the same. And maybe in the world of mathematics and some science it is, but really not in literature. We have one word for empathy, which I think I had mentioned before in one of these talks, that for us it kind of means sympathy, but yet lots and lots of countries in the world have 3, 4 different, and some 5 different languages for empathy. So they have different gradients. These different gradients are ranges of experience. I gave you 3 stories about ranges of my experience with snakes. You get this? Each one's a little different, right? So when you start to, this is the way it is. This is how learning occurs. So yeah, we can talk about, yeah, we have an experience in life that's different than the last one. We go to sleep at night, we have dreams, which when we were patterning it out and looking at how it's different than other pieces of knowledge, those are dream space. And then the hippocampus then with a little neurogenesis comes through and makes some chemicals, which updates those files. And now we've got new files, hopefully, as long as your body was healthy, right? And then that's a learning experience. And then you start to develop more and more knowledge, updated knowledge, and you start to kind of take out those superstitious pieces or the unknown pieces or the things that you made up start to become things that now are a little more reliable. Not 100% yet, but a little more. And maybe a little closer with mathematics. But then if you look at mathematics, anybody getting a PhD in mathematics today is working mathematical problems in a different dimension. Wow, that just all of a sudden sounds like, where's the space it is at? Yes, it doesn't mean quite that same thing. It just means that it's a different framework. So when I talk about a dimension, it means the numbers have a different relationship. We can find probability by using imaginary numbers, so we can start to see all those different things of probability that could come up. We can see all the variances. So it gets really complicated. If you delve into it for a long period of time, you start to understand it a little bit. When you're just having a casual conversation, it is very confusing. And when you read articles in the paper and stuff, they take a little bit of information. They then do what I said with our intuitive nature. We just simply don't understand something, so we make up something, and then we put that all together, and we're reading an article in New York Times or anywhere, and then we go back and look at the scientific literature, and it's like, oh my goodness, right? It's like um, when you're even looking at reports on something, and we say it's a 60% effectiveness, that means that 40% is ineffective. So when they show something that's 60% effective, they said, this is a good solution. It's 60% effective without anything, without changing the influence. It's a 50-50 deal. But if you put something in there to influence it, you can pop it up to 60%. Okay, that seems like you gained something. But then what happened to the other 40? Did they gain something or did they lose something? Right? So this is where it gets very, very complicated, right? And this is where all these conspiracy theories can come out. They look at all this stuff and they're doing the same thing. They're taking a little bit of data, but they're asking different questions, and then they see different outcomes, and they're starting to think there's a conspiracy. Well, yeah, to some degree, it's a conspiracy, but it's not necessarily a conspiracy. It just means that it was a limited scope of where they're looking at it. They're looking in this direction. Just like my snake I picked out of the water, it wrapped around and it just decided I wasn't going to hurt it. So by the time I had walked 5 blocks, all of a sudden the snake was just relaxing and absorbing my warmth, because that's what his task was to do, and it needed that warmth. That's it. It just got friendly. It didn't keep struggling and fighting with me for 5 blocks. It barely a block, and it calmed down. So these are all ranges. As you expand ranges of knowledge and information, you get more information. You get to how much you have to struggle with something, or how far back you have to be, or when it's going to be okay, or what is acceptable. Those are all elements of learning. You have to remember that a child born is attention deficit disordered, truthfully, and are looking at everything, right? And they'll get something that moves into their attention for a while, and they'll stare at it for a little bit, because of the fact that they're trying to develop depth perception and all kinds of things that we just take for granted. There's a lot of development stages that go through. The brain just is developing for quite a few years, and there's some phenomena that occurs. If you tape over or put a patch on a child's eye during a certain age and development in that first year, they'll lose depth perception for their entire life. And all that stuff's been documented. So it's interesting. It's a developing piece, right? Okay, so we start to understand that. So when I say we have two systems, we have a phenomena which we made up a lot of information about, and then we have a scientific experiment which we made up a lot of information about, but we have connecting dots to be able to think that the information is probably a lot more correct than the one we made up. And it probably is to some relative degree. But it just means that if we don't have that information, it doesn't mean that the other information wasn't beneficial, wasn't useful, or that we should insult someone or be able to say they're dumb because they had a limited scope of information, but they had something that saved them, that made a big difference. All right. So when I start to teach classes, this is my theme. I'm trying to get people to move out of all those places that produce limitations, so they can then influence themselves to be able to be secure enough to build the range, so we have more knowledge and more scope, yet we don't lose that sense of like, whoa, how close do I get, right? I saw a picture in Costa Rica one time, and it was a guy that had a whole chicken, was dead, but it was a whole chicken, and he was holding it out at arm's length, at his arm up in the air, and he was standing in mud that was about halfway up his calf. So it was not something he could probably run in very well. It was muddy. It wasn't up to his knee, but it was halfway up, and he was holding this up, and there was an alligator laying there on the ground in front of him, and its mouth was open. And with his arm all the way up, he was barely reaching the top of the mouth. That big alligator. And obviously he was in the process of reaching over to drop that into the gator's mouth so it could eat it. And I looked at that picture and I'm thinking, that is very interesting, because the gator would, of course, eat that, but gators you can't outrun them. And in that mud, you didn't have a chance. So after he took 2 bites and swallowed the chicken, why didn't he take 4 bites and eat the guy that was feeding him? Because you have to remember they're a reptile. Difference between, we're a mammal. I'm just giving you a clue on thinking. We're a mammal and we think we take care of things. Statistically, 95% of alligators and crocodiles that are born, come into life, die in the first 95% die in the first year of life because they're eaten by another crocodile or another alligator, even a family member. It makes no difference. They don't caretake their young. Mammals get into caretaking their young. So we have that original brain that, they like to call the reptile brain. And we have the mammal brain, which gives us the pace of all of a sudden having different ranges that those reptiles don't have. And then we get into the third, the cortex, which allows us in some areas to be able to integrate, to make changes, to be able to learn things and be able to store them somewhere in the neocortex out there. And we can store things, update things, and change things, a learning ability. So that's what makes us more or less unique. That's how us with such a small body have been able to survive on the planet, be able to find some balance, right? So those are the matrix of it. Lots of those things influence us. Lots of times I get people that all of a sudden have a fright, a fear, get into an accident, and then afterwards can't shake that picture, can't shake that memory, can't get out of that. So then we come in and we start to see if we can influence that to get them back into that piece of balance. Yes, a medical model may try to do that with drugs. And sometimes that works and sometimes it don't. It's all probability. I have people I come in and I have worked with, and my group of people have worked with, and we've made some amazing changes. I could tell you for stories forever, but so could all those people. And then the other turnaround is like, there are some people that come in, it's like, no, no matter what, the fear gets them and they're gone. And that's just it. It's like the end of the game, right? So it's finding a balance point and communicating. So when we start to look at communication, which is where I'm headed for this talk today, because the rest was just kind of review what we talked about in the past, is that we start to look at communication. There's an intriguing piece. For a long time, they looked at what you call gravity, which is there's two forces. Gravity now they don't want to call force. It's kind of an effect, right, of the bend in space-time. But nonetheless, when you're on a planet, because it's spinning, there's a piece that wants to throw everything off, and then there's a piece that wants to suck everything down onto it. So those are two pieces. So historically, you go way, way back into the ages of where it was a lot more metaphysical, a lot of just like ideas that they come up, and they would talk about those two streams of force as ascending, descending column. There's just two forces that exist that from being on the surface of a spinning ball, some get sucked down, some get sucked up. We literally get up in the morning and by the end of the day, we're shorter. Everybody shrinks a little bit. And then we lay down at nighttime and we spread back out again. The next day we spend the whole day shrinking down a little tiny bit. It affects us. There is an effect all along the way. We are constantly affected by all these things. We don't notice that effect. We might not even talk about that effect, but most certainly it affects it. So all those start to make changes, right? So when we start to talk about effects, we start to say, wow, if this is creating a huge amount of pressure on your body and you have, say, an injured knee, well, then it makes total sense, not just to put your knee up, but to actually spend more time laying flat, because that way it reduces the compression that's pushed down on the knee. Now, that sounds maybe a little silly, but spend a few more hours sleeping even every day or every week so that you can get some of that pressure off so that your knee has a chance to grow new cartilage and to heal. Those are just influences, right? This is just not hard science. It's like, so when people come in and they go, oh, my knee hurts, and you go, have you had an x-ray? Have you talked to a doctor? And they go, well, no, it gets better. Sometimes it gets worse. Okay, that's fine. So first thing is like, get off your feet a little more. Do you have a job where are you working as a waitress or on your feet all day long? It's like, maybe you need to take a look at your shoes, right? Maybe you need to take some supplements, right? And maybe if the pain doesn't stop in a reasonable amount of time or start to reduce, then you need to see a doctor. But nonetheless, you need to take some action. Non-action will not get you anywhere. As a matter of fact, usually it gets worse. It gets worse because the range narrows down for possibilities and the defensive pieces don't change. So pretty soon you get down to where your entire life is against a defensive piece. And now you're a homeless person living in the woods somewhere and everything is defensive. Do you get this? And so if you get a little bit of buffer range, you can then start to use this brain we spent so many eons on this planet developing to be able to take situations and find them in different sort of ways and then come on out and find some element to be able to take you out of that threat situation, because that threat situation affects your biology in a certain sort of way, totally defensive. Blood flow, everything. Come on, everybody probably knows that. If not, there's tons of books on it. So if you can get into relaxed mode, you can start to learn, you can start to understand things, you can start to communicate, you can start to be separated. So when we get into a period of time where we have a lot of dislocation, that means we no longer have locational references. That means we don't know how far away we need to be from a snake before that thing's going to strike you. We've lost those locational pieces. When we lost those locational pieces, the only way we're going to get them back is to be able to integrate with other people. Spend a little bit of time with someone and find out what's the safe distance. Share this knowledge with them, which is why in the very beginning, when we came into this planet eons ago, we started creating tribal natures and we got together in groups. Yes, groups at first were just families. Pretty soon they became second cousins and who knows what all. And then when we got into that, we had to start to make rules because you can't marry a second cousin, blah 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 blah. And all those things started to work themselves out. That was just very intuitive, right? At the time, tribal people have names for different cultures. It's based on your mom. So you can't marry in the same. Yeah, all this stuff is knowledge that we've started to develop, that we put titles on. And this is how our learning occurred. It's really very important. So as we build this database, then how do we communicate back? And this is what gets to be really interesting. I'll give you a quick example because I don't want this to go on for a long period of time. But for the most part, to give you an example, if you go to court, who sits the highest in the courtroom? The judge, right? And the jury group, they're in a box, a little bit elevated, but not as high as it. And so you are on the floor. It's like everything is elevated. So your communication. Now, let's go back to that energy I said on the planet. We have two forces. The old days, they called them ascending, descending column. Cultures are based on variations on those concepts. Eastern and Western cultural dynamics are based on a relationship between those. It's really kind of, so if you look at Western culture, Western philosophy, it has a priority as one of those being more important than the other. Eastern culture, Eastern philosophy has a priority, another column being, it's just so silly. It's just like, it's bizarre. We should attend to a bigger picture, and that's what we're trying to do. Those establish a balance. We spent a lot of time creating imbalance because we wanted to be all part of a very small tribe. And what we found out down through history is that the bigger a tribe gets, the more profound it can become. It just had to find some cohesion, something to pull it together, to keep it together, right? Big communities formed and then it got destroyed. And when we go back in history, look at those, it's because they ran out of water, they ran out of food, they could no longer supply products to them, and everybody had to go out and find on their own. So that's pretty much what happened to all those big cities in history. The weather changed, the climate changed, it got too hot, they ran out of water. It's like something occurred. We're kind of in that same mode right now. Things are occurring and it's going to change the whole dynamics of the planet. I don't know what it's going to look like, but I probably don't have to worry about it, but some of you may have to. So those are the elements. So now let's me get back to communication. With those lines running through us tells you that it's kind of like, we could say that's kind of like our attachment to the planet. Energy is running from the center of the planet out and from somewhere into space in, right? So we get heat from the sun coming down to heat up the earth, but then the earth turns around and puts out just as much heat as it gets from the sun. So we're not consuming it, we're just passing it along. It's kind of an intriguing thing, right? And so It's just finding balance. Every element is finding some piece of balance when you start to look at the bigger pictures. And so if you got these energies going through you, they just simply let them be in a balance. Just be present with them. You might even be able to feel them. If you start to make up stories about them and enlightenment and blah, 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 now all of a sudden you're preferencing. And now it's like you're moving away from balance, and now you're making the elegant people and the non-elegant people, or the whatever, right? So you start to look at those sense of balance. And now I said in a courtroom, there's a little piece where they start to play with this communication. Communication means these energies coming through. We can say that we could just make this up and say they're a party to creating you as a presence on the, because if one of them disappeared, we'd be smashed into the earth. If the other one disappeared, we'd just go off into space. So really, they're creating your presence on the planet Earth or influencing it to some degree. Now, then we look at the other communications, it's like, wow, that's profound. If I'm communicating straight across at a right angle, right, 90 degrees, then all of a sudden we're on an even keel. We're communicating. We don't have to have the same ideas. But now I'm not backing away. I'm not being defensive. We just have a communication. When I get to be defensive, all of a sudden the energy drops. It's pulling us back. If we got there in an even keel, we then have this communication. When it's looking up, then that means they have the authority and you don't. All right. So one of the exercises I used to do is I would have people sit across from each other and imagine that they're pushing from their stomach. Just imagine that you're pushing on that person from your stomach. Let that flow from your stomach and push. And that other person then just pays attention, because now they know what's going on. It's no big surprise. Someone's pushing on your stomach. And they could see, what does it feel like, right? And then they can take their heart and they can go from this place and they can push on the other person at the heart and see what that feels like. They can push from the throat area out straight. And then they can push from the top of their head out straight. And they can see what those feels like. And they can see, is there a difference in those experiences? And then they can take from one, and they can take from the top of their head and push down on someone's stomach or on someone's heart. And then they can start to notice, holy cow, why is that different? We're not looking for hard science. We're looking for influence. It's really small. Obviously, the influence is there because authority wants to be higher, right? The king has got the highest chair in the room, right? So look at look at uh, look at anything in a government level of authority. They got the leader of the house is up on a platform, right? Yes. So it's the very nature of it is that if we can bring communication down to this type of level where it comes off in a 90-degree angle, it means we are totally independent and our communication comes on a right angle. It doesn't get drugged down and it doesn't get drug up. It doesn't influence the creation of us on this planet. It's just simply a sharing cross. And so that's kind of a goal. It's like if you can sit there and you can just look at something. I have so many people that in some aspects of their life, maybe I have people dating that have certain problems. They all of a sudden feel like they're less than when they're on a date. I have other people that all of a sudden become authoritative when they're. I have people, well, you see people get promoted, everybody's friend, and all of a sudden become a boss. And now they're talking down to everybody. And all of a sudden they're like, whoa, can they be a boss and still be able to relate? Yes, they can. And we've had samples of people that are boss and still relate and accomplish goals. But our natural phenomenon is as soon as we get to a place where we're elevated on that platform, we're now talking down. It changes where the energy comes from those two streams, and where it starts to flow out and it starts to either push down on you or elevate where they have to give more energy to communicate up to you. So this is what I call structure. So the structure of communication means I used to work with my teachers when I was training them, and I said, when you're in a classroom and you're teaching, you want the energy to keep flowing. If the energy starts to drop, everybody in a room is going to notice it. not consciously, but they're going to notice it and they're going to adjust for that drop. And some are going to get defensive, some are going to get distant. You've just lost your connection. So if they get defensive, now you're talking down to them. Even though you're not trying to, they're going to perceive that. If all of a sudden they get too arrogant and this person don't know anything, then all of a sudden they elevate and now you're talking up to them. You're giving all your authority away, or you're taking their authority away. So I used to tell my teachers, get out of the habit of cutting people off. Cut them off. If somebody's talking, throw an example and they say, okay, now let's get back to your story. Cut them off. Don't do it from rudeness. Cut them off to keep it on a level keel. They're going to tell a story and they're going to go step A, B, C, D to get where they want to go. They do A and B, cut them off. Whoa. And then interject something and get everybody in the room on level B. And now let them go up to C and D and cut them off. And then get everybody in the room up to level D and get it back on that 90 degrees again. That's the structure. When you do that, people in a class, people in a social experience don't feel like they've been discounted, don't feel like they've been lost. Now, depending on your structure, some people like to operate as less than, right? We could go into tons of stories why that would be, maybe a very authoritative family. But then there's evidence to indicate that that's not necessarily true too, although it's an example. There are a lot of variables. There are a lot of examples. We still have not found something totally concrete. So therapeutically, when I'm working with someone, I have to be able to dialogue with those elements, not them, but the elements. I have to kind of isolate the elements and find out what. So I'm talking to the person right across here. As soon as I start to talk to some situation, picture, experience, something in them, I then all of a sudden notice, wow, now I'm talking down to them. I can feel them all of a sudden pulling away. And then I have to ask a question. What's going on right now? Tell me a story. What's in your brain? Talk to me a little bit. What's going on right now? Come on, bring yourself back up here. Let's get back up again. Let's get across here. I'm not better than you. I'm not worse than you. We're just talking. We're communicating. In this level of communication, we can learn. In this level of communication, we're getting told what to do. In this level of communication, we're being dictated to. So the structure of the flow of energy is a huge influence. So this comes into what I would call my more advanced classes. Yes, PA beginning classes, people just learn to ground their body and feel that energy. Beginning classes are designed to just have people feel energy movement in their body, right? That's it. They can feel the movement of it. And because we don't always make up all these dialogues about energy movement. We make up dialogues about rain and lightning and darkness and lightness and mean animals and nasty people and obnoxious people and people shooting at people and people with political ideas and people that all that kind of crap. And we like to tie into that and then throw frosting on a cake, whatever we like, and then make up 90% of it. And then we call that a theory. In science, a theory gets thrown out pretty quick if it doesn't have some substantial thing. The reason why it's really kind of hard to say very much about superstring theory, for example, because of the fact that we're having a hard time proving any of the elements. The theory and the concept imagined is profound. The math is immense. And so when we start to look at something that's on the very, very edge of our ability to perceive something. Remember, the universe, we have a lot of information about, but we only have a lot of information about the part of the universe that we can actually relate to, and that's only 5% of the universe. The other 95% of the universe is dark to us. So if you're really, really smart about sitting in your bedroom and you're afraid of the world outside because you don't have a relationship with it, you're going to spend a lot of time in your bedroom. That's because that's where your security is. That range needs to open up so that you can update files, so that you can have experiences, so that, and in that process, that experience needs to flow in this structured piece so you can see something. When somebody's working on something, I like to walk up and say, Wow, that's interesting. You mind if I ask you a question? Trying to be polite because they are working and I'm bothering them. Yeah, I'm paying them maybe, but I'm bothering them. So I said, it's wow, how long did it take you to learn that, right? It's like, wow, that's just amazing how that flows for you. I recognize I might get away with one or two questions, and after that, it needs to shut up and just watch. But I can start to see that relationship of that flow. By the time I'm done, the person notices that number two, I was curious about what's going on. That means I want information, I want to learn. And I've asked a couple of intelligent questions. So those are questions that I shared information with. And then I shut up. All of a sudden, now we're building a relationship. You see how our communication is not going to be, I'm not talking down, I'm not talking up. It's like, I'm not trying to correct them and I'm not trying to demand they do more. I'm just like on an even keel. And at that point now, by the time they're just about wrapped up, they'll start to share information with me, things that were hard to learn. This is not, doesn't look really hard, but it's really hard. If you're looking at sheetrock, it's like throwing that mud on there, spreading around. Yeah, it seems pretty easy, but you really got to get the texture to flow at a certain rate. So when you look at it from the side, it looks like even though it comes out and goes back in again, it smooths out over a large area. So the wall looks smooth. It doesn't look fractured back and forth. All those things are learning pieces that we get a sense or feel of, right? So this feeling sensation is legitimate in it. It's a legitimate piece. How does that flow? How much pressure do you put on it? How much pressure do you not put on it? Pushing too much, dragging too much, getting too much mud. All those things in any project you work on has some variability. In life, having the balance piece is the keynote. And we're always trying to get people to a balance. So if we had a lesson for today, the lesson was start to take a look at where your communication goes to different people. When you're at work, where's your communication go? You know, when you're at home, where's your communication go? When you're with friends, where's your communication go? If somebody cuts you off, all of a sudden you feel like you've been dropped. I get that from people. It's like they cut me off. They don't care. No, they cut you off because they're trying to keep this flow going back and forth. And so it's like all of a sudden, it's like sometimes I have to bring it up and say, yes, I know about that. What is your question? And then I have to then put it into context of what their experience is. But I don't know what their experience is until they reveal it. I have to let them think for a second. And then I can totally start to say, oh, okay, this is where your level of experience is. This is what I can share with you right now. And then I can say, oh, and the next step I think would be for you to go ahead if you really want to learn more about flying a kite, for example, then here's a few things you just don't go get a kite in the store and take it up and then put it up in the air and do it like that. You got to look at wind currents. You got to look at channels. If you want to really do it and get a line out far enough and get it high enough, then you're running into some math because if you don't get the kite high up enough before you start to get line out, that kite's going to drop and it's going to be laying on the ground. You have to walk all the way back and pick it up. You've got to get it up at an angle. So the way the string and the pull down is going to be different. So is there books on the mathematics involved? Yeah, most certainly there are. Right? They don't want to read a book on it, but you can kind of explain it to them, show them, run down a hill with a kite and get it up there, and then be able to say, hey, you need to pull it. You need to get it rise up. You need to find an upswing in a current. Let's move this thing along the line to all of a sudden you can see that lift. And then when you get a lift, that's just a kite. But if you're flying a hot air balloon, oh my goodness, it's really important that you do all that because you've got people in a balloon that's going to come down, right? So you start to see those are pieces of knowledge that are really expanded out and very useful. Everything in life kind of plays along with those. Find a balance, learn more. Find a balance, learn more. Find a balance, learn more. Keep that communication structure in line so that you're not talking down or talking up. Keep that on an even keel so that it feels like you're in a friendly nature, right? You're not putting yourself in some position. And sense and feel that it's worth learning. All right. So anyway, that's enough for this week. It's just a fun dynamic to play. It is really, really important. The more dislocation we have, the better that we start to communicate. It's really simple to see 50 people living in a field somewhere and think, ah, they're just trash. When I was a kid and saw homeless camps, I knew they were a product of GIs that came back from World War II and had no place to live, right? And so they were building home. When they left, they were 17, 18, 19 years old, for heaven's sakes. They were living in a bedroom in mom's house. Now all that has changed. There are more family members now. Other people have had kids in the meantime. And now they're married and they've got kids and they've come back and the war's over and they have no housing and they're living in fields. And they're so there was a lot of respect then at the time for the homeless. It's like we'd go down and try to help. It's like we understood their plight. And now I see a lot of people have judgment on the homeless because we don't understand their plight. But it's just a product of dislocation. I can't locate myself. I don't have a reference piece. I don't have a place where I belong and can build the nature of who I am. That's all it is. It really needs that interaction. It needs that communication. It needs that place of connectiveness. Doesn't mean it has to be charitable. That's not always connected. That's lots of times talking down. It needs that element of what are they willing to take? What are you willing to share? All right. So anyway, thank you very much. And it's Dr. Chris Lemmon. And if you have any questions, email me at Chris with two S's at wizardscatch.com. That's WIZARDSCACHE. I'd be glad to entertain your questions. I may answer them online or I may actually send you an email. All right, depending on the complexity. So we thank you very much for listening. We'll talk to you soon.